First of all, my name is Chris Totten. I will go over who I am in a second, but I want to start with a little intro. So let's say you want to find a way for your indie game to stand out from other games around it, but you want a unique piece of inspiration. Or maybe your dream is to work with a famous intellectual property that you're a fan of, but you want to know which version you can use. Spoiler alert. It's not the one with the red shirt. Don't do it. Maybe you're a small team or you have little money and you need to get creative with how you source assets. This is me trying to make music. What if I told you that these were things that media outside of games have had figured out for decades? Centuries even. And this gets into some really awesome stuff that I wish games would frankly do more of. So that's why today we're going to talk about making indie games with public domain content. So first of all, like I promised, who am I? So my name is Chris Totten. I am an assistant professor and I'm the lead faculty for Kent State University's animation game design program in Ohio. Ohio. I am founder and creative director of Team Nemo. Our latest project as Team Nemo is a hand animated non-linear platformer called Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends. I also have a small personal studio called Pie for Breakfast Studio, and the latest game for that is a tabletop storytelling game based on Don Quixote called La Mancha. I am one of the founders of the Smithsonian American Art Museum Arcade, and I have written several books on game design, level design, animation, art, etc. But we are here today to talk about public domain. So first of all, what even is that? Well, public domain is all of the creative work to which no intellectual property exclusivity rights apply. In layman's terms, that means they are not protected by copyright law. You can use public domain materials in your own work or as the basis of whole projects. Now, before I move on, a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. And if you are in doubt about a work, please consult an intellectual property attorney. So as long as you all understand that I am not a lawyer, we can move on. But in general, and I got these are available and they update every year on copyright.cornell.edu/public domain. The copyright terms for works published in the following years, assuming that you are filing the work for copyright, these terms are: after 1978, it is the life of the author plus 70 years. Between 1964 and 1977, 95 years after publication. Between 1927 and 1963, if during that period the copyright holder renewed the copyright, the term is 95 years after publication. But if that copyright was not renewed in that time, it's public domain. And if a work is from 1926 and earlier, completely in the public domain. But even with all this, you still need to do your homework. Some works are in the public domain, such as many of Edgar Rice Burroughs' books about Tarzan. But companies still extend their rights using trademark law. You can, for example, use Tarzan as a character in stories, as Dynamite Comics did throughout the 2010s in their Lord of the Jungle series. But you cannot call it Tarzan. And you cannot have Tarzan or Tarzan and Jane or other associated terminology in the title. It's all listed there. There's their trademark statement. Because Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated still holds trademarks on Tarzan the brand. So Tarzan character, public domain. Tarzan brand, trademarked. So beyond just defining these terms for you, I wanted to talk about what it's like using this material in a game, what some of the considerations and what some of the cool things, like artistic things, you end up doing when you create public domain games are. And so that is why I'm going to talk for the rest of the talk about opportunities that you have with public domain, how to use public domain assets and what it's like using public domain assets in your games, and also working with public domain intellectual property. So first of all, why do this? Why use public domain? Well, the short answer is that it's free. But that's a pretty good answer, actually. I mean, I could just talk over. No, no. In all reality, let's talk about some of the cool cultural things you do when you work with works in the public domain. So we're going to talk about one of my favorite cartoons of all time, What's Opera Doc? And if you are not familiar with this one or don't know it by name, this is the Kill the Wabbit one. So it's from 1957, and you know, through this we can look at how public domain artworks change their popular understanding over time. The cartoon, in which Elmer Fudd as Siegfried hunts Bugs Bunny, who then tricks Siegfried by impersonating his beloved Brunhilde, is based on elements of Wagner's Ring Cycle, originally performed throughout the 1870s. One of the most famous songs from this series of operas, The Ride of the Valkyries, also appears in the film Apocalypse Now, which has led, and this song, through this movie, became associated with helicopters and destruction. And, whenever you have a big fight scene, you often hear da 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 da. And this led to parodies and pastiches of this scene, including one in Far Cry 3. Okay, so let's look at this cultural lineage here. You see, all of these works use the same piece of music, The Ride of the Valkyries, which at the time of What's Opera Doc was in the public domain. So when images, music, and other sound enter the public domain, they can be adapted and changed over time through repeated use, repeated adaptation, repeated recontextualization. And can be cultural references that create particular moods or feelings in a work. And those moods or feelings that we associate them can change. And when you use these things in a work, you can change those moods or those associations. So some can even become so iconic that they add new elements to the legacy of the work, as in Apocalypse Now. Now the song is familiar with, perhaps not the most wonderful of things, but war and destruction and things like that, but which led to the scene in Far Cry 3. Being able to complete, but it's not just a pop culture reference. You get to complete the nod by including the original piece of music. And you could do the same thing too. You can use Ride of the Valkyries right now, today, in your own work. Here's a link to a public domain recording of it from 1921. I'm going to pause so anybody who's interested could take a picture of this slide. Please let me know if the link still works. So this brings us to the use, though, of public domain assets. So here's a game. It's a rather good game I like a lot. Four Last Things by Joe Richardson, and it even has a sequel. It's a point-and-click adventure game made from art clipped from Renaissance paintings, actually put into Photoshop, clipped out of Renaissance paintings, and turned into assets for the game. The source of the artwork and the Monty Python-style humor make for a really unique piece of art that has been honored with awards and placement on lists of innovative games. We put it in Sam Arcade. We were super excited to receive it as a submission. Here's a screenshot from one of my own games, Liszewski's Revenge, which was based on the work of 1920s graphic designer El Liszewski. I was able to make the art assets myself because I'm mainly a visual artist, but I had trouble finding good music for the game on the usual sites like freesound.org and others. So I turned to a website that tracked the history of music from the era and had a number of recordings from the era that Liszewski was making his posters that were also in the public domain. Since they were older recordings, they also had a nice record scratch to them, which led to a lot of nice texture to the game, which I really appreciated. Now, like with properties, I should note that when you are dealing with assets like music, Also with photos or photos of paintings, things like that. A piece, like Ride of the Valkyries, may be in the public domain, but a performance or a recording of that piece may not be. So always make sure that when you are sourcing assets, you are using public domain versions of the piece. That's why that link had a 1921 recording. It's in the public domain. Now, for my game, getting public domain music saved me a ton of money. It saved me some time. But you should note that that still didn't make making games easy. There was still a lot of other non-music parts of the game to make, such as artwork, doing level design, scripting the thing, doing sound design, all that other stuff. Also, finding the right tracks was not an instantaneous process. That took time. There were great recordings that were not in the public domain, and there were some public domain ones that didn't quite fit the mood I was going for. So I would say that finding the right piece of music for each level still took about 2 weeks for this game's 3-month cycle. So in terms of proportion, that's still quite a bit of time. So make sure that you plan for that if you are going to source assets in this way. Okay, now to the really good stuff. How do I make games based on public domain IP? So let's return to Oz. No, don't return to Oz. It's copyrighted. There we go. So the original Oz books were written by L. Frank Baum between 1900 and 1919, which, if you're keeping score, puts them all squarely in the public domain. And this is why you get so many interpretations of Oz by current authors. This is why there was that period, like a few years ago, where there was like 3 Oz movies out at the same time. It's not only that this is a beloved and well-remembered intellectual property, it's also that you don't have to pay licensing fees for that. But think about the works that have emerged because of this. If anybody's read Wicked, it's quite an amazing book. It's quite an amazing reinterpretation of this universe, and all because it's working with public domain work. Now, again, I cannot reiterate this enough. If you are doing this, make sure you do not take elements specifically associated with copyrighted derivative works, such as, for example, with Oz, the 1939 MGM film, which Warner Brothers owns currently. So keep the slippers silver, not ruby. Just like with Winnie the Pooh, don't put a shirt on him. These are distinctions you want to make. But if you can do that, you could make an Oz game, like City State Entertainment did in 2012 with March to Oz. You could have an Oz game with Ride of the Valkyries in it. Why not? I don't know if that would quite fit, but Or did you know that George Romero's original Night of the Living Dead is in the public domain? You can watch it free on YouTube. And it's completely legal. So due to a failure to issue a renewed statement of copyright by its original distributor, the film is in the public domain. Indie developer Salt and Pixel knows this and is making an amazing looking prequel to the movie for Game Boy in the GB Studio engine. That's the wonderful thing about public domain. You can add to this story, add to this setting. So as you can probably guess, public domain stuff, and I've mentioned this, is a big part of my practice. My 2 most recent games are a tabletop storytelling game based on Don Quixote called La Mancha. Don Quixote is a novel from 1605, very public domain. And my latest project is called Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends, based on the 1905 comic strip by animation and comics pioneer Winsor McCay. And here's why I like to use this content. First of all, again, free. Cannot emphasize this enough. It's free. You can do it. But beyond that, first of all, is that if a work has existed this long and people are still aware of it, it has a built-in audience. And that built-in audience may actually exist beyond gaming. So yes, sure, you're going to have fans of it. And maybe there have been some adaptations over the years, like with Little Nemo, where that people may still remember. But you also then maybe have audience members who are in the associated field. Like, so, with Don Quixote, people who are interested in literature, with Little Nemo, people who are interested in comics and the history of comics. You may also have people like teachers or historians, film buffs, librarians, things like that. So you have gateways into new audiences that you may not have had with, something more commercial game, centric. And this leads to more opportunities to show your game. Ever show your game in an art museum? Talk to me later, I can hook you up. This offers you opportunities to show your game at venues like art museums, libraries, bookstores, other places that are new opportunities to get your game in front of people beyond the usual convention circuit. So I always get this really important question. Is this fan art? Technically, yes. These are things that I am a fan of, and I made work based on them. But I can distribute these things on marketplaces and promote them in ways that I can't always do if I were doing fan art. And the art world has a term for this. It's called a derivative work, which sounds like it's being snobbish to it. But really all it means is a creative work that includes major elements of an original. So this turns into things like parodies or any work that responds to an original work, like the Duchamp work here. So as with using public domain assets, again, make sure you sort out the risks involved, the trademark and who owns what adaptation and things like that. But when you make a game based on something in the public domain, you are creating a new iteration of the original that adds to its cultural footprint that new audiences can consume. Museum curator Teresa Bebnister uses this to make a distinction between fine art and fan art. Fine art is that which the artist subjects to peer-reviewed curatorial process like those found in galleries, journals, and art museums. Fan art can certainly show your artistic skill as an artist, or could be a good way to show that you can do the job of a commercial artist or illustrator. But those processes are very different from curation and preservation that you see in these cultural institutions. It's very different in how commercializing these works is handled. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is do what great art does, using intellectual property to say something new with old material. We can see this with Ride of the Valkyries, just as I hope we see this with works that maybe some of you will produce after this talk. So my background is in architecture, and this is something that we're taught in school. We are taught to study precedents, to look at cultural works around us and which came before us to get inspiration, or even just to learn how other artists solved problems. Maybe an artist solved a problem that we're running into. Maybe they're working in a style that we find appealing. Maybe we want to make a work that directly reacts to another work or contradicts that work. The point is, this is stuff that the arts do and that games aren't always great at, but that we can do better. There is this kind of hang-up sometimes about pure originality that other fields don't seem to have. Maybe it's because games also come from tech, which is concerned with patents and commercialization based on the patent. But as we become more of a fine art, we have to get used to this aspect of it. And you should do this with your games, because other arts have had this figured out forever. There's even a cool book about it. Buy this book, it's cool. I like it. Again, this by no means makes your work easy. Making a Don Quixote game allowed me to get lots of positive buzz and funding and talk to some really awesome people who study literature. But it was still a 2-year project, including managing overseas manufacturing and shipping, which was definitely a new experience for me. Likewise, doing a Little Nemo game the right way means lots of research and experimentation to understand Winsor McCay's art style and how to translate that art style into a video game. But, again, it also was a great way to get funding, to build an audience, and to meet some wonderful people. And this is more of a personal thing, though, but it takes a lot of effort to honor a work properly. This is not to say you can't reinterpret or even reinvent source material. And let's be clear, given the eras in which these things came out and the problematic things associated with them, you probably should reinvent them quite a bit. But you should also avoid cheaply slapping the IP's branding onto something that doesn't fit with. So real quick, before I wrap up, a few things I wanted to shout out. While I'm here, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that every year there are folks who are trying to get more public domain in games. There is a yearly itch.io jam to make games out of the works that have been fallen into the public domain that year. Go check them out when it rolls around next January. Also, the Spanish Ministry of Culture has hosted game jams, public domain game jams, to celebrate cultural works created in Spain. Those are really cool. Go learn about them. And I also wanted to throw this down. Every so often on Twitter, somebody says, hey, but when are they going to make public domain Smash Brothers? Let's do it. I call Don Quixote and Little Nemo, but like, let's do it. That would be amazing. I would totally collaborate on something like that. So, to summarize, public domain assets and IP are great ways to make unique games, get work done, use recognizable franchises, find fans, but making games is still hard. Remember to use the version that's actually in the public domain. Remember to read about copyright versus trademark. And please, please, please properly honor the work. Don't just make a cheap knockoff. And that's it from me. Let me know if you have any questions. And here's just a bunch of nice pictures of Little Nemo. We're looking for a publisher, if there are any publishers in the room. So thank you. So yeah, he's got the right idea. Come up to the mic for questions.
Thank you for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the amount of time that it sometimes requires to find the right piece of public domain work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips for exploring that universe of stuff?
Okay, so the question was, do I have any tips for exploring the universe of public domain assets? So in terms of the public domain assets, first of all, again, find out whether the recordings on the site are from an era that would be in the public domain. Check any license information on any resources. For example, for Little Nemo, I go to this site called Comic Strip Library quite a bit. And, I went in and looked at their licensing terms and everything like that because, if we are pulling artwork from those copies of Little Nemo, we want to make sure everything's covered. So there's that. Set a series of goals, and this is really with any asset, but set yourself some goals. Like I said with Laziski's Revenge, I had a set of goals, and I went in, and I didn't just kind of like say, okay, here's what it is. Do I need to change it? I had the ability to say, okay, I want these certain qualities. Some you'll find a really rich supply of things. Sometimes it won't be as rich, but try to do as much as you can for what you want to accomplish with it. You will maybe sometimes need to go on like outside the beaten path. I don't remember how I found the site with the music that I found, but it was definitely not a site that I would have known about beforehand. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, and thanks for the talk as well. I was going to ask a similar question about music in terms of, essentially a database of public domain works if you happen to know one that you're using.
I unfortunately, well, that's not true. So if you're looking for stuff like to check the copyright status of things, Library of Congress. That is like, where you will find most of the information on what is copyrighted and what is not. So that's the easiest one to recommend. There are some specialty ones, like I mentioned, the music archive that I happened upon for Laziski. But I think you kind of have to get into like more deeper targeted searches for stuff like that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I would say that I have a game that kind of floats around with parody
Okay.
in the era of like Little Mermaid. But with the context of Little Mermaid, I kind of have a lot of thematic things that are similar to like the Disney-ish thing, in the sense of how the character looks. There's a lot of the music kind of has similar things. How much do you feel like leaning on some of these pre-established like contexts and themes to like keep that audience that kind of floats around these things? How much do you value that over kind of remixing to create your own thing from it?
So the question was, when you are making a work and you're working with a public domain IP, how much of a popular adaptation do you try to reach to? Am I summarizing this well? Okay, so we actually had to deal with this directly with Little Nemo. Some of you may know that there is a 1992 Capcom game on the NES based on a 1989 TMS movie of Little Nemo, and it has a big following among retro gamers. So we had a lot of people wondering, is our game based on or a sequel to that game? When you are working with these things, you absolutely want to stay away from explicit inclusions of stuff. Our Little Nemo, I'm going to speak in terms of like stuff from these adaptations, does not have a squirrel friend, does not wear animals as suits. It's probably good, but it doesn't have these elements. Do we have a frog? Does that frog like candy? Yes, but it's a visually distinct frog. You really need to make sure that anything you include is visually distinct or audio distinct. So you want to be careful. And if you are wondering, consult a lawyer. Yep. I am not a lawyer. Yep. Yes.
Awesome. So you're an instructor as well, Professor. Can you tell me a little bit, when you introduce this public domain stuff into your curriculum, A, what was the student response, and B, what was the work that the student produced? What was that like?
So when I've used this in the classroom, so the question was, what is the student response when I do this in the classroom? Students initially struggle with this because sometimes it does pull them out of their boundaries, but that's exactly what it's meant to do. This is supposed to kind of jar us out of like just using the same old inspirations. So after some initial teeth gnashing and struggling, they eventually get it. It also does help that like because I make games with this, I can directly demonstrate like, here's how I present this, here's how I write this up, here's how I promoted this. And then they start to see how it applies to real project, or not that student projects aren't real. You know what I mean? How it applies to like commercial outward-facing projects.
Mine is kind of the opposite of the Little Mermaid problem. Is that when you have public domain things that has been used a lot, how do you prevent players from thinking something will be a certain way and being able to derivate from that and do something very original?
So the question was, and we dealt with this with Nemo too, how do you have, if there is an established version of a public domain, how do you convince players to get away from that? You really have to clearly communicate and set expectations for your version of it. Again, no, we don't have animal suits. But here's what our game does have. And as long as you can communicate that in your marketing materials and tutorials, et cetera, you kind of are setting the same rules for your thing. And we've found that audiences actually appreciate that. We've had audience members specifically say, hey, we like that you're not doing the same Nemo game. Okay, I am being told that we are at time. I do see that there are other questions, but I can meet you outside to answer the questions. Thank you.